G'day everybody, how are you going today? It is so good to see you, and I've got something a little bit interesting. It might be considered a curveball, but I think it's an important one because this camera represents something that I think Nikon is circling. Will they do the same thing or won't they? We're going to get to test this camera out, and we're going to get to understand what it is good at, what Nikon needs to do, where a Canon's sitting, and what might they do next? What camera is this? This is the Sony A7 R5. Let's talk about it. And we're going to unbox it. Now I do have to thank Mr. Bruce Connolly, a dear friend of mine. He has used every camera under the sun, all the full frame ones, Canon, Nikon. He's a Canon printer seller and a very keen photographer. Loves making really large prints. And he's been circling around the A7 R5 since it was announced. He wanted to see the price come down a little bit, and the price now has come down. It's dropped, I think, more than $1,000, something like that, here in Australia. And it's brought it very, very close in the USA. I know that from a recent video. Both the Canon R5 and the A7 R5 are both almost $4,000. As I talked about in that video, both of those cameras are pretty similar. And where is the unicorn Z8 going to land? Does it even exist? Well, we have even more rumours on Nikon Rumours about the Z8, which seem to sit similarly to what I was talking about in regards to it being similar to the Z9, but sort of a cut down version. So look, we've got all the usual stuff in the box. I'm probably slowly getting darker here, but you know, we've got an awesome sunset, so it's worth it. And as you know, I love testing out these cameras. I love making them work for a living. So this is a very high dynamic range situation. We got cables and manuals and cable holders and a beautiful A7 R5 strap here. How nice is that? Living the dream. And here it is, the pièce de résistance, the Sony A7 R5. Let's have a look at what's in the bag. Now, what Sony do is make small cameras. They absolutely do, but I have to say this does immediately look more chunky than my A7 R3, just by a little bit. And the grip, well, I think their grips are slowly getting bigger, but they're just still not as big as other grips. And as someone pointed out, on the Nikon cameras, I'm not sure about Canon, but the trigger button is actually raised above. It's raised a little bit higher here, and that's actually a more comfortable position. It means this finger doesn't have to bend as much. So just minor ergonomic things, but I think one of the most exciting things that absolutely everybody can agree on about this camera is this screen. Not only does it do all of this stuff, but it also does this stuff. It does that as well. It's like a super duper flippy very angle, does everything the screen. Let's go back to the studio and do some comparisons. The sun's about to set. The sun setting. All right, we're back in the studio from the beach, and here it is. Here is the Sony A7 R5. And yes, indeed, it's a good looking unit, and as we talked about before, it has this really awesome flip out screen that not only does that, but it also does this. And I don't believe there is any other camera on the market today that does this, and I'm sure plenty will come to follow ASAP. Well, it pretty much allows for every type of screen action that you would want. Let's have a look at the original A7 R. Here it is here. Now, I purchased this back in 2013, 10 years ago. And quite frankly, well, it was tiny. And the reason I bought it was because it was like, well, I'm shooting with, I think at the time it was the D800E, a much bigger unit. And we will get back to this, we will circle back to this. But to give you an idea of the difference, so here's a D850, which is pretty similar to a D800E versus the original A7 R. And you can see why it was of interest to try something different. Absolutely was. Just extraordinarily different in their sizing and everything. Now, there are pros to having a smaller camera, but there are cons as well. And I suppose the biggest one was ergonomics, but there's other things like battery life and so on. But ergonomics is the biggest one. Over the years, Sony have made things bigger. So here we have the A7 R3, and it is bigger. We can see it's a bit taller. We can certainly see that the grip has changed size. Absolutely, it's changed size. It's significantly thicker in the body. And it's quite interesting that this stuff changed. It just kept changing. Also, the ergonomics changed. They kept changing button layout. This stuff kept evolving and adding buttons. There we have it. We've got 1, 3, and 5, and they get bigger over time. It's quite a change. So that original notion that a lot of people talk about, that original notion of small mirrorless, has been discarded by the people that started it, which was Sony. And the new one, let's have a look at 1 versus 5. And funnily enough, 36 megapixels versus 61. So certainly performance has changed, but gosh, there is such a huge difference in the size of these machines. Just have a look at how much thicker that has become over time. So yes, thicker, taller, everything has changed. I personally have never been that worried about it. I mean, I suppose at some point a camera could get too big, but neither of these are particularly a problem for me. And these are still smaller than, here we go. Let's get out a D850. And as we can see, it's got a mirror box. It's got all sorts of things going on that a mirrorless doesn't. Mirror box being the main one, and that's a big deal because that's a huge moving part that's got to fit in there and move up and down. We can see a big height difference. But interestingly, if you take into account the mirror box, things are starting to not be that different from a thickness perspective. And width-wise, the width is a little bit different, but still, it's pretty similar. The A7 R5 is the biggest of the A7 Rs. One thing I was acutely interested in is how has the grip changed? And yes, the grip is a little bit bigger. It is a little bit more comfortable. But I want to show you something that I think is pretty important that Nikon do that Sony don't do. Now we can see here the chassis of these two bodies are the same height. Nikon actually raises the trigger just a little bit higher. Now, is it much higher? No, there's actually not a great deal in it, but when it comes to ergonomics, there not being a great deal in it is actually a big deal. So it's slightly higher, although I can see that they're elevating it here at the actual button level. So maybe at the end of the day, these are quite similar. But if we go back to past cameras, it's just not as high. And in the case of this one, it's actually lower. If we put these side on, you can see with the original A7 R3, the A7 R3, this trigger is lower. And that actually causes fatigue because you've got to bend your finger more. And look, I'm interested in this stuff. Just last week, I completed a shoot that went from 6:45 a.m. through till 9:30 p.m. Now, I have talked about these types of shoots before. This was a commercial shoot for an advertising agency working on a campaign, which I'm hoping I'll be able to show you once that campaign's out because it was really cool. But fatigue is a big deal when you're talking about that sort of time in one day. And every little millimeter counts to how your hand behaves. So there's just things like that. And well, it does look like it's been improved with the A7 R5, and it's getting pretty close. Now, one thing that I've made a video about that I didn't put out because I was just simply concerned that Sony users would get too excited about it, but I'm going to talk about it here in this video. And this is hand grip. The hand grip, where it is relative to the lens mount and how certain lenses behave because of the mount size and how Sony decides to build their cameras. Now this lens, an extraordinarily common lens, the 24-105 f4. Of course, Nikon has a 24-120 f4. And what Sony have going on here is a bit weird. When you stick your hand, and this happened to me with the A7 R3, is that my finger, and I think you can see it there, my finger actually rubs on the lens. And over a long period of time, I bought this as a travel lens. I wanted to have it as the only lens when I went away to Europe, and I did do that. For 4 weeks, it was just the A7 R3 and this lens. Now, I can tell there is now a bit more space. They've changed it slightly. So depending on how I'm holding the camera, there is a gap there now, but if I move around, that gap gets closed. So I'm really pleased to see that there's been a minor ergonomic shift in the grip, which allows this lens and my fingers to fit. And that simply wasn't the case prior to this. Now, I tested this with the A7 IV and my fingers still didn't fit. And another lens that I've tested this with is the 50mm 1.2. There just really isn't a lot of space between the grip and some lenses. It doesn't happen with all lenses, of course. It's just with lenses that have to come down and sharply go into the E-mount. So I'm pleased to see that they're heading in the right direction. My finger is still rubbing, just depending on how I'm holding the camera, where gravity is. Like it's better, but it's still not far enough, because on my Z cameras, my fingers never touch any lenses, ever. It's never happened with any Z camera or any Z lens. I've never had this phenomenon before, but I've had it. And I've used very few of Sony's massive range of lenses, let alone third-party lenses. I've used probably something like 8 to 10, and of those 8 to 10, 2 of them, my fingers don't fit properly between every camera that I've tried so far. And that would include the A7 R3, the A7 IV, now the A7 R5. It's better. There is a bit more space there. We're heading in the right direction. Ergonomics are huge to me. Like I said, I wanted to point it out. Now, as this is the unboxing and first look, we're just going to talk about ergonomics and buttons and things they're doing here. Another thing I find interesting is that the button that changes us between video and stills, it's not super ergonomic. It compared to what, again, and you know, we all just compare it to the things that we use. This is harder. It's just harder from a one-hand perspective. This is not to do with muscle memory. There also seems to be, you've got to push down to make it happen, I think. Has a little push down mechanism. And what it means is this feels like it's kind of got to be a two-handed operation. And you know, this is what originally stopped me from buying a Canon back in 1997. I looked at the Nikon F5 and the Canon film equivalent at the time, and it was ergonomics that stopped me from purchasing the Canon. Even so, I was told it had faster autofocus. I didn't particularly care about that. Even back then, I didn't care about that. I've maintained consistency around that subject. And trust me, autofocus didn't do then what it does today. It was ergonomics. You couldn't operate the Canon one-handed. This is the same. You can't operate it one-handed. What I am super excited about is to see that there's a dedicated button, because on this older camera here, the going over to video required you to rotate this, and that's just counterintuitive. There's some problems that occur with that. But so now there's a button. That's something that I talked about, and they've done it. So that's good. Layout's good. Comfort, I still don't think it's as comfortable as a Nikon grip, but that's fine. And yeah, there's a lot of weight. There's a lot of weight hitting. Again, the way that Sony design their grips, the weight just doesn't seem to be as well distributed into the hand. I will spend more time with this and I'll let you know more. Oh, another camera I wanted to compare with is here. It's the Fuji, and this is really interesting because, and I've got an adapter on here. This is the firmware adapter, which allows me to mount all my F-mount lenses. And you can see here that the new Fuji X-H2S is pretty chunky and pretty sizable compared to these cameras, considering this camera, the Fuji, is an APS-C camera. Like, why does it need to be as big? But it actually is as big. So what's interesting to me here is that the Fuji X-H2S and this brand new, very expensive, twice the price. And of course, they're different cameras. They've got different specs, which is part of my point. This is just an APS-C camera, 26 megapixels. This is like the top of the range, the most megapixel Sony you can buy, yet the cameras are really similar in size, really similar in width, really similar in chunkiness. You can see that there, very similar in chunkiness. They're super similar. And why is it? Now answer me this, why is it that a camera that's half the price has a screen on the top, and this button here This dial here is over here. Why is that? Why can't Sony give us a screen on the top? So there's a few little frustrations there. What I love about what Fuji's done is, relative to this camera, this is a big grip. Relative to this camera, Pro, very expensive, it's okay, but I just literally think it should be a bit bigger. Anyway, there's the Fuji, interesting stuff. Another thing that I'd like to briefly touch on is function buttons. Now, Sony don't have them, and that's because your finger doesn't really fit very well down there. Again, this is all about ergonomics, but it's just a really tight fit and you don't have much access. So function buttons is something that you miss out on with the Sony Alpha experience. And it doesn't matter, even if we go to this very old camera here, there is no function buttons. There's never been any function buttons on the front. Version 3, it also has no function buttons and space is very tight. Jump over to a Z7 and Nikon are completely confident about how their function buttons work, the fact that they're there and they're easy to press. And with a camera like the Z6, Z7, the 2s, Z5 and so on, even your Z50 and so on, we have function buttons. But it's not just Nikon, even Fuji on the XH2S, we've got a function button here and a function button in here. So again, this is all just about lenses, confidence, space, plenty of space here compared to what's going on in the Sony. And here is the godfather of function buttons, the Z9, which has 3 of them here. We can see them very clearly and they're there. They're just simply an extension of what you are doing. They're all here where you need them. You hardly have to move anything. You don't have to take your finger off the trigger finger. It's just an absolutely extraordinary experience. I've heard Sony users talk about the fact that there's lots of customizable buttons, but I don't think it's that helpful if they're not in the easiest, most ergonomic place. I do wonder if and when the Z8 will it have 2 or 3 function buttons here at the front. We talked about before how my fingers hardly fit between this lens here. You can see it. This is the 24-105 and you're looking at this area here. And I just want to show you the difference between how the Sony works. This is a Z7 and I can't actually see that, but and this is a bigger lens. This is a 120. So not only have Nikon made a bigger lens, a 24-120, but well, it's far more comfortable, as we can see. And you've got function buttons, which I can happily and easily press. I'm pressing them now. It's just a very different ergonomic experience. This camera, that's very expensive, will be similarly priced to whatever camera I think comes next from Nikon, has no function buttons. And I think that's a bit of a miss. Got recording, headphone, USB-C, USB micro, and a full-sized HDMI port. Now, Sony do ports well. That's a great set of ports. Everything you pretty much need. The only thing that some people might expect in a camera at this price point is an Ethernet port, but you know, there's a lot of connectivity here to do things different ways. Card slots. Card slots is something that I think Sony does really well. And of course, in the A7 R5, along with a number of their other cameras, including the A1, we have dual slots. It's an SD slot and it's a CF Express Type A slot, which is a much faster format. I love this idea. The fact is, in essence, you can have either 2 SD cards or 2 Type A or a mix in this configuration here. It's a really smart idea, in theory, in principle. In reality, right now, Type A is super expensive, and based on the technical specification that is ratified for these cards, it's half the speed of CF Express Type B and won't get as large. And that's because it's physically smaller. Any Sony camera with this format won't be able to go as fast or as far as cameras with CF Express Type B, but I still think this is an amazing outcome because you've got potentially 4 cards that can go across 2 types
going in 2 slots, obviously not at the same time. So if you can get over the fact that the cards cost a lot and that price will come down, there is more and more companies coming into the CF Express Type A space, and the fact that it'll never be as fast or as large as CF Express Type B, I think this is a really great solution.
All right, and before we go on doing any more comparisons, what we're going to do over the coming week is I'm going to be shooting on Sony lenses and on Nikon lenses to try and get a sense around diffraction. Is diffraction a thing? Can we show diffraction? Can we stick this lens, for example, I can pop this Sony lens on my Z9, we can take a shot at, say, f11 and see what's going on. And then we can take a shot on this camera here, the A7 R5 at f11, f16, see if there's something different. Like, technically, this is higher megapixels. We should get a better result, but will we start to see that pixel level kind of defocusing, or whatever you want to call it, blurring or whatever? We've seen rumors. Z8. One would have to think that the Z8 is real at this point because it's the only camera that we hear about. And, well, the rumours seem to be speeding up. And we've even got a date that there might be an announcement in April. Yay, that's very soon. And it could ship as soon as May. And what did we hear most recently? What most recently, and I'll tell you what, this will make sense why it's relevant in a minute. Most recently, we've been told it is somewhere between a Z7, there's a Z7 for you, a Z7 and a D850, it'll be somewhere in that size point. Well, that's pretty cool. Somewhere in that size point, great. That'll mean it'll do all the things that a Z7 will do because it fits inside a Z7. Might do some things that a D850 does because it sits inside a D850. What I find most intriguing about this is that if the Z8 is coming and it is going to be a competitor, I believe, to the R5, Canon R5 and the Sony A7 R5, and from this moment forth I will just call them the R5s, my mind still boggles that they're both in the same segment of the market, they're both the same price, and they both have the same name, or almost the same name. My mind boggles, I don't get it. Did they not have lunch, Sony and Canon, that week and say, guys, we can't do this? They just did it. Here is the A7 R5. The A7 R5 and the Z7 are very similar in size. So what it's looking like is, if it's true that the Z8 is going to be somewhere between these two, well, it will be from a volumetric perspective, larger camera than the A7 R5. Now, does this matter? No, it doesn't matter that much, but I would just continue to talk about ergonomics. And another thing that we can talk about here is heat dissipation. This is an 8K camera. It does not do 8K anything like a Z9. Firstly, it crops the sensor a significant amount. I think it's 1.25 or 1.21, somewhere in that vicinity, the crop. And that's because it's just natively using the sensor. They're not going to the full size of the sensor, downsampling 8K. They're getting 8K from the 8K size of the sensor. That makes sense. It just literally means they are either worried about heat, battery, power consumption, all of that. They're worried about all of that, so they're not going to sample an 8K image on the fly. This is a small camera and it's not going to cope with a lot of heat. It's probably not going to cope with that sort of heat, and it doesn't have a huge battery in there. It's a D850 sized or somewhere in between. It's got more volume to dissipate heat. And if it is that Z9 sensor, there doesn't need to be any downsampling. We get actually 8.3K if we get RAW. Fingers crossed we get the 8.3K 60p RAW. Who knows? Because it's still the Z8. But I can see how this camera, now all the bits of information that we're getting, we've got this camera here, we've got the R5, which is sort of halfway between these two. We can see that this camera just makes, the Z8, it makes more and more sense every second. And we can see from Nikon Rumours, the specs that I talked about a few weeks ago seem to be coming true. It is going to be this sort of size. If it's the Z9 sensor, then it's almost 46 megapixels as opposed to 61. As I've said before, it's only a 13% difference. Why go down that path? Hopefully Bruce will allow me to borrow the A7 R5 again once the Z8 arrives, if and when it arrives, and we'll be able to see, we'll be actually able to test how do they compare head to head. And really interestingly, the rumours around the R5 firmware update, along with the R5 II, are also starting to ramp up. There's more and more noise in this space. So why are Canon making more noise unless they're about to feel threatened? It's so interesting, this stuff. We've got this arriving in the market recently. We've finally suddenly got noise from Canon about firmware updates for the R5, and perhaps a clearer understanding of when the R5 II might come, which, let's just be clear, I believe it's next year is what the rumour says. Ergonomics, for me, how it compares to some of its fellows, the Nikons, the Fuji, yep, they're getting there. It's getting better. Ergonomics is my biggest issue. Next, in the next installment, we're going to have a look at diffraction, and then after that, we're just going to have a look at files. How is it going to look? All right, well, everybody, let me know, are you interested in an A7 R5? Are you interested in a Z8, which would be 61 like this, or 46 megapixels like a Z9? Keeping in mind, I just want everybody to keep in mind that 13% difference. It's just over 1,000 pixels. It really doesn't make that big a difference. And in my heart of hearts, I really can't see 80 megapixels. The only way I can see that happening is if the diffraction question is answered. And Fuji, that's why I was looking over there, Fuji have a 40 megapixel sensor in something smaller than half the size of 35mm. And one last point about this camera right here. And this is something that Bruce told me. Okay, to the best of my understanding, this camera here, the XH2S, has the only stacked sensor in an APS-C camera. It's 26 megapixels. Guess what the APS-C in this camera is? 26 megapixels. So Bruce's theory, and I like this theory, is Sony make this sensor, it's based on this tech, and that the A7 R6 or 7 will be this sensor, but 35mm. It's really interesting stuff to see how all the bits of the puzzle join together. But the incremental update that this is from the A7 R4, you would need something serious, and maybe it is a stacked sensor, because this sensor is, well, it's slow. It's not anywhere near as fast as a Z9, an R3, an A1, or this thing here. These things are fast. Let me know your thoughts. Which direction might you go in? Is it a Sony direction? Or maybe it's the mythical Z8? Or maybe you'll see yourself on a Z9. Damn fine camera, we're shooting on it right now with the 50mm 1.2. I think at 1.3, just to do something different. All right, it's been so good to see you. And if this is your first time here, I would love to see you again. So please share, please subscribe, and please like. Okay, bye for now.